Welcome to the Ancient Way podcast, where we discuss what it looks like to live as a Gentile following a Jewish Messiah. Put simply, we want to help others rediscover an ancient way by embracing the Jewishness of Jesus. We're glad you're here. Jim, so good to see you again.
Great to see you.
Always good, always a pleasure. Today, we are going to talk about the Sabbath and intro, just a series of conversations between Jim and I about how we stumbled into the Sabbath. But first of all, why should you Sabbath? For many of us, this may be a foreign word to our Western culture. We're used to going all the time, week after week, day after day. There's always something to do. And so when we discovered and really kind of stumbled into this idea of Sabbath, the question for us was, how do we break free from this way that we're just flying by the seat of our pants? How do we cultivate a lifestyle that enriches our soul and deepens our love for God? And what we really discovered is that there's this ancient practice rooted in Scripture that we'll talk about today that has been here right before our eyes as we're reading the Bible that we just never really connected with. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like for us. What does the Bible say about the Sabbath? And go from there. Jim, I know we're not going to go too deeply into our experiences today, but both of us have similar but slightly different ways that we just kind of stumbled into the Sabbath. For me, I read a book about the Sabbath, and it just kind of leapt off of the page where my wife and my family, we just decided, hey, we're going to try this. And that led to, 6 to 7 year journey with where we are now. And for you, I know you had a similar but different experience. If you want to share just briefly what that was for you.
Sure. So, I was raised in the Catholic Church. Somewhere around when I was 17, I was introduced to a born-again experience, a more personal relationship with Jesus Christ than I had previously known was available, and flourished there. Lived pretty much in the New Testament, going back to the Old Testament just for informational, but not really embracing it all that much. And as I became a more mature Christian, I realized how significant the Old Testament was. And when he takes such care to just say, this day, don't give me another day, that day is the day I consider holy. In fact, I'm going to double your provision in the wilderness on Friday so that you don't, out of actual need, have to violate this Sabbath. He himself protected it. And I thought, this sounds a lot more significant than I have actually, because I was raised in a tradition where we didn't work on Sundays, and we did go to church, and there was a family day. And to think that God was saying Saturday was it, and that somebody else decided, he can have Sunday instead. I started looking into it more, and then I wound up, one of my friends became a Messianic Christian. And, so there's Messianic Jews who are actual Jews who come to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah, and they enter into the kingdom by way of Judaism, retaining their Judaism, only adding to it that they found the Messiah. From a Christian perspective, I've actually embraced a lot of Jewish ways because the God who called me, who sent the Messiah, was actually the author of all things Hebrew. So,
That's awesome.
Thank you. Thank him. But I went to a Sukkot, so like an 8-day festival you have in the fall, and I was so moved by the community of this mixture of believing Jews and Christians who had come to respect and embrace their Jewish roots. It just felt so aligned with Scripture. Like I felt like this is what it was supposed to be. This union of Jew and Gentile under the headship of Jesus Christ. That I said, that's it. It was 2014 Sukkot. So that October in 2014, I started becoming Sabbath observant. My wife thought I was out of my mind, and she tried it with me. She felt like she was on timeout, didn't go for it.
Oh man.
And I did too, actually. But I have come to love it. It's just been the biggest blessing. I have had a very hard driving week, and I am so looking forward to. I mean, I know we're not going to get involved in the details, but we start. Right. So John, you are way more traditional than me. I'm way more a Gentile in the Jewish world. We start with communion, so we don't actually do the Kiddush. But we actually do. We start with a glass of wine and matzah, right. And we start with communion, and then we sit down out front in what I'd like to refer to as the garden, that little setting that we have there. We sit down there and have a glass of wine, and it's the switch that flips off the week and flips on the rest, and that has been gorgeous. It's really awesome. Changed my week. There are times where I really want to get things done, but to tell you the truth, I just honor it, and
that's so good.
That's pretty much how I came.
That's
to
great. It. I mean, that same thing you're describing. I mean, we experience that every Friday night in our family. Like our kids look forward to Shabbat as well, and it's nice. Like it anchors the entire week now that we've been doing this for a few years, and it's like maybe hard to understand until you have actually tried it. So for people who may not have Sabbath before, or like intentionally set aside that time, this may sound a little foreign, but what I'm really hoping as we continue this conversation over a few episodes, that we'll get into some of the nuance of like how we like tried certain things and let some others go, and what that looks like, because it's definitely a journey, right? You're talking about 2014. So it's been what, 9 years now for you that you've been Sabbathing. And for us, it was 2016. So we're right at, 7 years. So I'm excited over the coming weeks to get into that. So stick around for future episodes. Today, however, what we're going to kind of center around is really, what does the Bible say about the Sabbath? For many of us, like we mentioned before, we just may not be familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And for me, when I started thinking about this, there are more things or traditional things that my family does. One of the things that we do is we read a passage from Genesis 1 and 2 every single Friday. And I think this is a good place to start, because here we are. We all most likely know the creation story. So we have this divine creator God who has created the entire world and everything in it out of nothing, just by the power of his words. And he's done this over a 6-day period. And it's fascinating that before the law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, before the Israelites became a nation, God, in his first act of creation, is intentionally saying, here's the seventh day. I am all powerful. I can do anything. I don't need to rest, but I believe out of his love for us as humanity, as his children, he sets an example for us to follow in resting on the seventh day. And so Amen. In Genesis 2:3, I'll read this. It says, God blessed the seventh day and he separated it as holy. He set it apart because on that day, God rested from all his work, which he had created, so that it itself could produce. And there's so much like packed in here that I just love. One is he's intentionally saying this day is different. It's set apart. Right. The word here that you might read in your version of the Bible might say holy. And that literally is just a way to say that it's set apart. It's sure, in one sense, set apart for God. And I love that.
May I interrupt you here, please?
Yeah, interrupt me.
What you just said is exactly why I observe Shabbat. It is 100%. When I read that and I said, yeah, but I do Sunday because that's how I was raised, like tradition. And I looked at that and he set this day aside because he wanted that day. When did we get the idea that we'd say, yeah, it's like Bon Quiqui, you could have a Coke. It's like, no, I and this one really troubled me. And did honestly for about 10 years. I just never acted on it, but it bothered me. And then as I become more and more aware of the Hebrew roots, I just couldn't defy this verse. And that's the verse that pushed me over the edge why I had to do it. So that verse is particularly meaningful to me.
That's great. I mean, this might be a little bit of a tangent, but for a lot of people, I know when I first stumbled into the Sabbath, I always thought of Sunday as the seventh day. And a lot of people hearing this might think the same thing. And I'm not trying to like necessarily nitpick on this, but I think it's worth mentioning that when you look at ancient tradition in when the seventh day was observed, it has historically been on Saturday, not
True.
Sunday.
Yes.
And that was something that I didn't discover until like later after we started Sabbathing.
Yes.
And what was fascinating for me, trying not to get into the details here, but we tried Sabbathing on Sunday and Saturday, and that might work for some people, but we just continually felt drawn to Saturday, which is just fascinating to me, having done this for 7 years.
You know, John, Sunday is the venerable day of the sun. I mean, you can say that's what I was raised. I'm comfortable. I do Sabbath, okay, fine. We're not here to arm wrestle with anybody. But it's the venerable day of the sun, and the living God of Israel, of every Christian, Yahweh, the Most High, Father God, I don't care what you call him. He said this day is the day. And we say, yeah, but we like Sunday better. It's like the day that honors the God that the entire pagan world worship. We want to honor that day. And that's the other like facet of this diamond of a verse that got me. I said, and the day I'm picking is the venerable day of the sun. Fabulous. Well, what's next? Like these are the things that troubled me to the point and brought me to a place where I would embrace Shabbat.
That's so good. Now, you just said the word Shabbat, and I think it's worth explaining this. So in the verse that we just read, there's a passage where it says, on that day, God rested from all his work. And when you look at the actual Hebrew word for rested, it's actually Shabbat. And so this is where we get the word Sabbath from, which more of us are going to be familiar with. Shabbat may feel a little foreign because we don't often speak Hebrew. But I find this like, it just really stands out to me because it really defines the day. So the word Shabbat literally means to cease or to stop. And we could probably unpack just that. Like, what do you cease or stop from? But this is where we get the word Shabbat. And when I hear this, it's very easy for some people maybe to get into feeling like, well, there's just a bunch of rules and legalism around this idea of stopping. But for me, what really stands out, having done this for a while, is that the Sabbath is really a gift from God. Yes. He's saying he knows what we need. He knows that we need to stop and to rest and to have a chance to just replenish our souls as we are intentional about how we handle that day. And that's something that's been over time as we've done it, something that's just been really good.
So, I'm trying to learn Spanish, and it's like the word for Saturday is Sabbath. Like, so
what's
for Latin
what's
cultures,
the Spanish word?
El Sábado, but it translates to if you say the word for Sabbath, they'll say El Sábado. If you say what's Saturday, El Sábado, it's the same word.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, what's really interesting about that is Latin culture historically was largely steeped in Catholicism, who practiced Sabbath habits on Sunday. But every time they said, what are you doing Saturday? They're saying, what are you doing on the Sabbath?
Wow.
And obviously in Spanish, it's large, there's contextual inferences. No one's really thinking that they're saying, what are you doing on the Sabbath? They're saying, what are you doing on Saturday? But their mouths are uttering, what are you doing on the Sabbath? And I thought, wow, it's like right there, right in your face.
That's crazy. I never realized that. That makes me wonder now. I'm not going to look it up, but I want to know how many other languages have a similar theme where it's literally referencing the word Sabbath.
In French, it's not that way. It's samedi would be Saturday, but I don't believe there's a correlation.
That's fascinating.
I just thought it was ironic that the truth, like, so this is really a non sequitur, but so if Hebrews will generally not pronounce the official name of God, and heaven knows we may not even know the proper way to say it, but Yahweh is actually breath. Like the Yah is like an inhale, and the way is like the exhale, and it's like the first thing that comes out of a human being is the name of God as they get their butt slapped, and suddenly they take that gasp and they utter
Wow.
an approximation of his name. It's and biblically speaking, we were created with the breath of God, and our first breath utters his name. And loosely, let's say. But here we are in a Spanish-speaking world. They're actually referring to it for what it actually is. Like, recognize it or not, know it or not, they're still saying, does a little baby know it's uttering the name of God? No, but it is. And
That's amazing.
did they say, is anyone registering, what are you doing this Saturday? But there was, what are we doing this Sabbath? Yeah, they don't know, but they are.
Wow. Yeah, they're still speaking it. That's amazing. That's so good.
It's neither here nor there, but
I love it.
Kind of interesting to watch life unfold.
It's so great. Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty other things like that we just don't know because we don't speak a specific language. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, the second thing I wanted to bring us to is, so we talked about Genesis, right? The first time that God mentions the Sabbath is in the first chapter of the Bible. And I find it interesting here where he doesn't really say how to do it. He just says, stop working. It's set apart. It's different than all the other days, and to rest. There's another time that we read about the Sabbath in scripture, and it's when God gives the 10 commandments to Moses on the mountain in Exodus 28 through 11. And what I find fascinating about this is there's actually more words devoted to the command to Sabbath than any of the other 9 commandments. So that's interesting.
Wow.
So I'm going to read it here. It says, remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. You are to work 6 days and do all of your work, but the 7th day is a Shabbat to Adonai your God. In it you shall not do any work, not you, your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your cattle, nor the outsider that's in your gates. For in 6 days Adonai made heaven and earth, the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the 7th day. Thus Adonai blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. So I find it so fascinating here, just the amount of breadth that's covered in this verse.
Yes.
So he's not just saying, just for you, but he's clarifying basically anyone in your city, anyone in your household, including your animals. Like, it's a Shabbat. It's a time to stop working, and you shouldn't do any ordinary work. And so here we find, like we mentioned before, like God created us as humans. He knows that we need a day to rest. And so at the beginning of time, and then he reiterates it again in the commandments, that he's giving us a rhythm for life, for all of his creation, including the animals. And then because he knows we need it.
Yeah. You know what I see in this, it's so did God need to rest? Well, no, he's God. Was he just setting an example? I don't think so. I think, again, now we're into personal opinion. I will preface it with that. I think God is so about the beauty and the wonder of life. Like, he didn't give us nutritional items. He gave us taste buds that could really enjoy food and be made strong because of it, making wise choices with food. But he's all about the beauty of life. And so when I see God choosing to Sabbath after 6 days of creating the universe, I see it's because he understands how to live, and rest was part of the beauty of the life he designed. So did he need the sleep? No. Did he relish in a life worth living? Yes. Even him choosing to enjoy the beauty of rest.
That's so good.
And so typical of his heart. Everyone gets this, even the animals. Everyone gets this moment of beauty.
Right.
And I think to perceive, again, when I first started practicing Shabbat, I felt like I was on timeout. I was hating it. hating it. But now I realize it's part of the beauty of life. And how did I get there? By conforming my life to his word instead of trying to conform some religious structure to my life. I went the right way, the way that is worship, where his word was going to contradict my opinion and I was going to line up with it, only to discover I was finding beauty. I was finding fullness in this thing I thought I was losing. It's just so typical of him.
That's so good. That's why I like in my mind, I think of the Sabbath as a gift, right? We may not initially see all of the reasons that make it a gift because we don't like to slow down, or it might feel a little weird or awkward trying to do it. For me, Jim, my experience was kind of the opposite of you, because I'm so used to just going and driving really hard through the week to get stuff done. The first time we Sabbath, it's like the first time I feel like I completely disconnected from everything.
Nice.
We put our phones up. I was present with my wife, and I only had one kid at the time. And man, it just made me aware at how, like, it was like 2 p.m. I think when I looked at the clock, and it felt like an entire day had gone by. Wow. And we had really lived it and embraced it. And then we still had more time available because of God's goodness.
Yes.
Saying, hey, here's a day where I want you to meet with me.
Yes.
It was so good. I think it's another good reminder, like, speaking of just being busy all the time, that, like, when you look at the Israelites, they were slaves in Egypt. And so in one sense too, God's saying, you're not cogs in a machine. You're not a slave to the system of the world. And in stopping that day, it's a chance for us to also live that out, where we're saying, God, we trust you the same way that you provided for the Israelites in the desert with manna. Like, you're going to give us everything we need. And so we don't have to work on this other day, because we're trusting that God's going to provide. And I don't know, just,
I think we say it in one of our subsequent episodes that there's a group of people who outlive most of the standards by about 10 years, and that would be the Seventh-day Adventists. And if you added up the Saturdays of a typical lifespan, it winds up being 10 years.
Wow.
So while they have backed up from life in literal worship and a preference to God's ways to their own, they get it back, statistically speaking. Generally speaking, they outlive other people by 10 years. And
wow,
it's almost like, so Israel went into bondage with Nebuchadnezzar 70 years, a year for every Jubilee, the Sabbath of Sabbaths that they refused to give the land. God imposed upon them in bondage. And which would be the other verse, which kind of encouraged me to realize how seriously he took it. But you look at these Seventh-day Adventists, which I'm not a Seventh-day Adventist. However, I'm really impressed. You got all those 10 years back. Right. You gave up something in worship and you got it back. Wow. That's impressive.
So good.
Yeah.
So
I'm quoting John Comer in the Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. If I'm believing his statistics, he cites his sources, but he's the one from whom I learned it.
Which is a book that's worth reading. And what I'm hearing, Jim, is if you want to live longer, you should consider Sabbathing.
Yeah.
So you heard it here. Go read the book, Ruthless Elimination of Hurry.
They say people who commute, I mean, the brutal New York City commute or anything in Miami, you will typically live 10 years less than your average person because it is so stressful to commute that way twice a day, every day for 5 days in a row for your entire working life. This is the flip side of that. You get 10 years extra because you learned how to stop.
Yep. It's so true. Now, you mentioned John Mark Comer. One of the things, Jim, we've just kind of had conversations about is around the idea of being intentional around the Sabbath.
Yes.
And so tell me what that looks like that idea of being intentional versus just, is this just a day where I can, do some chores around the house or coast through it? Is it
Yeah,
does
and
that
that
work?
kills me. That actually kills me a bit because I'm always aware of those little things. I just didn't have time. Like the handle on my office door needs to be fixed. Every Shabbat, it raises its nasty little head and encourages me to just, well, when it says not a day off, it's a day of rest. And um, I have a daughter who lives out of town, and she'll call me every Saturday, every Shabbat morning. She calls, and I sit and have like I go through a fairly extravagant process to make coffee, as you well know. It says probably you outdo me there, but still, it's fairly, I'm grinding beans and all that stuff. And Shabbat, I don't. I make right now. I'm on my stove is steeping a pot of tea that will steep all night long, and then tomorrow I'll wake up. Tea is ready. I have a bran muffin from Whole Foods, and I just wake up and breakfast is done.
Nice.
Shortly after, as I'm finishing that, the phone rings, and I spend often 2 hours on the phone with my daughter, and then I'll. But my wife and I will often take a bike ride, but we're not burning calories. We're just taking a leisurely bike
Right.
stroll through the neighborhood and come home. It just couldn't be more pleasant if we tried. Um, and that's pretty. And we used to in full disclosure, I've been remiss in this. We used to cook ahead of time. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We understood the menu by Wednesday. It was made. It was nukeable or shove in the ovenable. Like it was just very easy to eat
Yep.
literally to dine. And we've been a little remiss there, to tell you the truth. But the day is still a gentle day, and the intentionality comes with preparing to have that
Totally.
day. Yeah,
Yeah. I think that was the thing that stood out for us too, is the fact that we knew we didn't want to work. Well, then you have to ask all the questions that you're saying. Well, what is rest? What am I going to eat? Am I going to cook? What do we have to prepare? And I think that act of intentionality is really what shifts your perspective, because it's so easy when you don't prepare and you're not intentional to just kind of coast through it. And
true.
before you even realize it, it's not real rest. So that idea of being intentional makes a huge difference.
No question. You could have a restful day that isn't exactly rest, and with the intentionality, you get a day of rest.
Totally.
I probably need to get tighter there. We
Yeah.
I've done some idiotic things too. We've talked about this. I've gone to a restaurant that's really busy, so it didn't make a difference if I was there or not to the people who were working. But I don't do that anymore. But um, as I said, this is, and you know what? That's exactly why we're here, to lay it out: what worked, what didn't, what was smart, what was just
Yes.
idiotic. How could I have my way and call it Sabbath anyway? That's why it's our raison d'etre. It's why we're here, because people would have a much easier time embracing this if they can learn from our mistakes.
Totally. I think this is a good segue as we start to wrap up this episode, is that it can be easy to lean into this idea, well, you have to get it just right and you have to be perfect. And really it's this idea of law versus grace. And I think that's important for us to acknowledge and end with, is that there isn't a right way to Sabbath. And if you're so focused on getting the minutia right, you might be missing the point of this amazing gift God has given us in a day
Amen.
to rest.
Yep.
So I'm sure we'll get into more of this as we talk about how Jewish person may observe the Sabbath versus us as Gentiles. But I think there's, as we're talking about in this Ancient Way podcast, a rich legacy rooted in Hebrew soil that I think we can learn from, that can fill us up and
Absolutely.
just help us find a better way to live as we're following our Messiah. Well, what you can look forward to in the coming episodes, Jim and I are just going to continue to talk through our experiences with the Sabbath, like you mentioned. What things that we tried, what do we actually do? The way that Jim and I both start Shabbat is different, and this may be beneficial to you. We'll talk about
Yeah.
things we don't do, and things we really just kind of learned, maybe a little bit the
Yes.
hard way.
Yeah.
And
Often the
we'll
hard way.
talk through times Kiddush, something that my family does. So stick around, and I'm sure we'll continue to have just a really good conversation. And we're glad you're here participating in it with us.
I'd like to offer a spoiler alert. John and I are perhaps bookends, and by that I mean polar opposites. And John is always going to be the more traditional one, the one more aligned. Me, I'm a Gentile, and I'm trying to find how do I do this retaining my Gentile persuasion. But at the end of the day, what we do is very compatible. We've even shared Shabbat and not stepped on each other's toes because we know it's a work of grace and joy, not a one of law.
Yes.
And, I say this specifically to invite any of the listeners who want to try it. Find your way. Yahweh, our Father God, is going to lead you, and you may align with us, you may not, but it's just a glorious process. And that's one of the things we will cover, like, the grace versus law, and that's going to be a very critical thing to receive here. But get ready for John being right and me being Gentile version. So
I love it. This I think is what's so great, right? Because there's so many different expressions in God's kingdom, and you get to participate in that firsthand. And I love it, Jim. The way that you keep the Sabbath, I love it. It teaches me something every time we talk about it, to not take things so seriously, and things that have filled me up that are more maybe traditional. We've been able to have good conversations. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's been great. Have a lovely week.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Ancient Way podcast, where our work is made possible by generous supporters like you. To find more podcasts and free resources, we invite you to visit theancientway.org. See you next time.